This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 55 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is Thursday, June 22nd, 2017, and smelling of something delicious and comforting that your mom gives to you when you're sick is way better than reeking of tofu and broccoli sweats. On this week's episode, we jump into all of the work and frustration associated with building a city from a scratchy, bitey, black water swampland. Sickness, exposure, and simple lack of resources find Joe and friends in desperate need of brokering whatever deal necessary to establish a new home for the thousands of homeless Mormon refugees. We get to our newest introduction to the NaMo nickname family, and Joe begins dictating his own revised history to be published in the Times and Seasons, of course in response to the recent uprising of the Spalding theory. Later on, we'll be talking dangerous American history with Professor CJ of the Dangerous History Podcast. Be sure to check out this episode on patreon.com/nakedmormonism to gain full access to our full discussion. But first, let's wet our palate with some milk to prepare us for a proper helping of meat. Last time we were with Joe and friends, we spent the whole time talking Matilda Davison and Hingepin Rigdon. Upon the Prophet's escape from Sheriff William Morgan and his arrival in Quincy, Illinois, the Spalding theory saw a brand new resurgence in the popular media, and Rigdon was forced to issue a response. Absent that response was anything concrete to explain the origin of the Book of Mormon, or really anything that made it anything other than a blatant denial, relying heavily on ad hominem attacks and calling the Spalding theory a moonshine story. The Spalding theory would never die. Historians, both believers and non-believers, have written it off or considered it nothing more than tinfoil hat conspiracy history since its inception, but the theory has yet to be thoroughly disproved. Despite its longevity, very few legitimate historians today espouse the theory.
As the scriptures say, they must have milk before meat.
Hey everybody, just before we get into the meat of the show, I wanted to speak to you directly for just a second, and this is kind of hard for me, and I want to be really honest with what I'm trying to do here. As most of you know, Naked Mormonism, or podcasting, is my career now, and in order to do the research that is necessary to make this show happen, I couldn't continue to do it as a hobby. And that means I have to ask you guys for money, and I'm sorry about that. That's just a fact of reality. And I want to say that off the bat, if you're a student, if you're unemployed or between jobs, if you can't afford to send us $1, then please, by all means, do not. But I do this show for free, and I will continue to do this show for free as long as possible. But if you're somebody who's in a position that can spare $1 or $2, or it's the price of a coffee per month, I just want to ask you really quickly to head over to patreon.com/nakedmormonism. That's patreon.com/nakedmormonism and sign up to be a patron today. We're kicking off our pledge month, as is done by many other types of publicly funded things like this. So this is the beginning of our pledge month between now and our live show at Squatters Pub in Salt Lake City, which begins at 7 p.m. local time on Saturday, July 29th, with the lovely Marie Kent, my co-host from My Book of Mormon podcast. So I'll be revamping the Patreon goals, and we're giving away some stuff. We're adding new incentives, and of course showering NaMo fans with gifts. We have many exciting things planned, and I can't wait to tell you guys about it over the coming weeks. So here's how to get in on it. If you're a long-term listener of the show and you've never been a patron, head on over to patreon.com/nakedmormonism and sign up at whatever patron level you want. You'll get a shout out on the show as usual, and you'll be eligible for new rewards that we're going to add, and you'll be eligible for our fun giveaways during the pledge month. If you're already a patron, I'll just say thank you so much, and you too can play along with us by increasing your pledge by as little as $1. Next week, I'm going to tell you guys about one of the bonuses that I have planned for Pledge Month, so get in on it today. That's once again patreon.com, patreon.com/nakedmormonism. You know you love the show, you're listening to it right now, and if not for Patreon and the support through that, you wouldn't be listening to it. You've also thought about becoming a patron before, so please make the decision to finally pull the trigger and support the show for as little as $1 or $2 an episode. And Patreon is a secure site. It's been updated and it just takes 90 seconds and a credit card to sign up. Thank you in advance for the generous support of the show, and that's enough of that. Enough of the hard sell. On with the show. Joe and the leadership had contracted with Isaac Galland to purchase the tract of land known as Commerce, Illinois, among many other places. Located around the middle of the state on the far west border with Iowa, the riverfront settlement of Commerce, Illinois was home to just a few cabins, some small acreage of improved farmland, and of course, millions of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Known as the ague, which included a few possible diseases, the recently drained swampland proved less favorable to settlement than the previous settlements in which the Mormons had found themselves. Utterly destitute of morale and monies, the Mormons could afford little else more than the unimproved land and some seeds to plant in the ground once the lush vegetation had been cleared. They came from Missouri with everything they had, which wasn't much, and they were hell-bent on making a new life for themselves. This is from Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, beginning on page 256. Quote, "The river," meaning Mississippi River, "the river bank rises gently here to a point so high that one standing on its summit can see the river cutting a great silver semicircle at one's feet. When Joseph Smith stood on this hill after his escape from Missouri in 1839, the spot was wooded and trackless, and swamps covered the lowlands behind him. But he could see the glistening river with its islands lying to the north like lush garden places, and the green Iowa hills beyond." Quoting Joseph Smith, "It is a beautiful sight," he said fervently, "and it shall be called Nauvoo, which means in Hebrew a beautiful plantation." Back to quoting Brody, "Nauvoo had the melancholy music of a mourning dove's call and somehow matched the magic of the sight." End quote. There was much work to be done. The arduous process of clearing frontier American land and taming the wild swamp was a trouble that affected all who began settling. The leadership was amidst constructing houses for themselves from which to conduct church business and administer to the sick, while the majority of the thousands of homeless saints spent every night lying under the open sky, exposed to every element and the harshly freezing humid spring nights. P. Parley P. Pratt, who'd been one of the earliest and most prominent leaders of the church since his conversion in mid-1830, had escaped imprisonment and was once again united with the prophet after their long separation beginning the previous year in Missouri. This is from Parley P. Pratt, P-Cube's autobiography, hosted on boap.org, that's a Book of Abraham project, and a link will be provided in the show notes. Quote, "The hardships and exposures consequent on the persecutions caused a general sickness. Here and there and in every place, a majority of the people were prostrate with malignant fevers, agues, etc. When we first arrived, we lived in the open air without any other shelter whatever. Here I met Brother Joseph Smith, from whom I had been separated since the close of the mock trial in Richmond the year previous. Neither of us could refrain from tears as we embraced each other once more as free men. We felt like shouting Hosanna in the highest and giving glory to that God who had delivered us in fulfillment of his word to his servant Joseph the previous autumn when we were being carried into captivity in Jackson County, Missouri. He blessed me with a warmth of sympathy and brotherly kindness which I shall never forget. Here also I met with Hiram Smith and many others of my fellow prisoners with the glow of mutual joy and satisfaction, which language can never reveal. Father and Mother Smith, the parents of our prophet and president, were also overwhelmed with tears of joy and congratulation. They wept like children as they took me by the hand, but oh, how different from the tears of bitter sorrow which were pouring down their cheeks as they gave us the parting hand in far west and saw us dragged away by fiends in human form. After the gush of feeling consequent on our happy meeting had subsided, I accompanied Joseph Smith over the Mississippi in a skiff to visit some friends in Montrose. Here many were lying sick and at the point of death. Among these was my old friend and fellow servant Elijah Fordham, who had been with me in that extraordinary work in New York City in 1837. He was now in the last stage of a deadly fever. He lay prostrate and nearly speechless, with his feet poulticed. His eyes were sunk in their sockets, his flesh was gone, the paleness of death was upon him, and he was hardly to be distinguished from a corpse. His wife was weeping over him, and prepared clothes for his burial. Brother Joseph took him by the hand, and in a voice and energy which would seemingly have raised the dead, he cried, "Brother Fordham, in the name of Jesus Christ, arise and walk!" It was a voice which could be heard from house to house and nearly through the neighborhood. It was like the roaring of a lion or the heavy thunderbolt. Brother Fordham leaped from his dying bed in an instant, shook the poultices and bandages from his feet, put on his clothes so quick that none could get a chance to assist him, and, taking a cup of tea and a little refreshment, he walked with us from house to house, visiting other sick beds, and joining in prayer and ministrations for them, while the people followed us, and with joy and amazement gave glory to God. Several more were called up in a similar manner, and were healed. Brother Joseph, while in the Spirit, rebuked the elders who would continue to lay hands on the sick from day to day without the power to heal them. Said he, "It is time that such things ended. Let the elders either obtain the power of God to heal the sick, or let them cease to minister the forms without the power." End quote. It's an interesting little addition there. Fawn Brodie, in her work No Man Knows My History, notes that no healings were actually recounted in Joe's journal at this time, likely because every success was met with scores of failures in healing the afflicted Mormons. She does point out, however, that Emma, being quite learned in root doctoring, was just as much attending to the sick as any of the brethren, even though she was in a weakened state, having just borne their fourth child, Don Carlos Smith. Throughout most of May and June 1839, the history of the church recounts mostly single-day line descriptions of Joe and the leadership's activities. It's from the History of the Church, the Source and Text Critical Edition by Dan Vogel, beginning on page 319. Quote, May 13th, I was engaged in general business at home and in transacting a variety of business with Brother Oliver Granger, and gave him the following letter. And then there's a letter after that, but we're not going to read it. May 15th and 16th, was engaged in a variety of business relating to the general welfare of the church. May 20th, at home attending to a variety of business. May 24th, the 12 made a report of the proceedings of the 70s, which I sanctioned. I also approved of the 12 going to England. End quote. We're going to talk on that last entry in a minute, but in between each of those single-line entries describing what Joe was doing every day is an overwhelming number of letters going in and out of commerce to and from the prophet. The only way to handle the myriad challenges facing the Mormons was to send the right letters to the right people to get the right things done. The last entry we read is a fascinating detail about the 12 going to England, and I'm really not sure what to make of it. I have some theories, but it requires much deeper research before I feel comfortable revealing it and discussing it knowledgeably. But Joe approved the 12's petition to make this mission trip out to England. And from my best understanding, the Mormons had proselyted to so many places near their settlements. You know, they'd taken mission trips all throughout New England and Canada and even into the northernmost southern states to, try and build their numbers and bring in fresh blood and money. With everything that had happened which caused public opposition to the Mormons beginning in 1836 and 37, national newspapers had painted the Mormons as either a small group of crazed religious fanatics or something of a new Christianity led by the power of Satan to drag people away from true Christianity. The entire Missouri Mormon conflict had raised national awareness that the Mormons were a force to be reckoned with. Very few Americans had not heard of the Mormons at this time, whether it was from their local newspaper or just in passing conversation with those who were eagerly following the Mormon drama as it unfolded on a national scale. Europe, however, was an untapped market. The missionaries began their first trips in 1835, and the majority of European countries were none the wiser to what was happening to the Mormons on the other side of the pond, making those people ripe for conversion. As the Mormons were settling in Missouri, Joe had told the missionaries to motivate Europeans to move out and help them settle in Missouri, or they could just, send their money along to help the church, who, the majority of them were incredibly destitute. But still, the majority of Europe was, for all intents and purposes, an untapped market with a lot of wealthy people who were eager to hear the gospel. What makes this so odd and worth contemplation is that Joe and the Mormons needed the 12 and their management abilities in Nauvoo now more than ever, and yet Joe still sent them away. It makes me wonder if the work couldn't be better accomplished with a distribution of labor among the 12 apostles. Maybe splitting them up and having 6 of them go on a mission to Europe while the other 6 remained in Nauvoo. That would have caused less responsibilities to fall on the shoulders of Joe, Hiram, and Rigdon. Maybe putting off the trip until they were a bit more settled and there were a few thousand homes in Nauvoo instead of just a few dozen shacks. That would have made the transition into Nauvoo settlement a little bit smoother. Interestingly enough, though, we see something in the letter exchange occur that I have yet to see anywhere else in church history. And it came out of this evolution of the power vacuum that was left when the 12 departed for their mission to England. It's remarkable to see it occur now, as it seems to be indicative of a trend shift that was slowly beginning to take effect. This letter that we're going to read was sent to a judge and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Cleveland, from Commerce, soon to be Nauvoo. The letter detailed some interesting information, to say the least, but I am most fascinated by what the end of the letter implies. I'm going to read a few excerpts from the letter and point out why it's fascinating when we see who signed the letter at the end. This is from the History of the Church Source and Text Critical Edition by Dan Vogel. I'm just going to call this the Dan Vogel History of the Church, page 328. Quote, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Cleveland, we write you in order to redeem our pledge, which we would have done before now, but that we would have been in the midst of the bustle of business of various kinds ever since our arrival here. We, however, beg to assure you and your family that we have not forgotten you, but remember you all, as well as the great kindness and friendship which we have experienced at your hands. We have selected a lot for you just across the street from our own, beside Mr. Harris, and in the orchard, according to the desire of Sister Cleveland, and also on the river, adapted to Mr. Cleveland's trade." It continues later on in the letter. "It would give us great pleasure to have you all here along with us, which we hope to enjoy in a short time. I have also remembered Rufus Cleveland as the surveyor, and am happy to be able to say that the land in Iowa far exceeds my expectations, both as to the richness of soil and beauty of locations, more so than any part of Missouri which I have seen. Addressed to Judge Cleveland and Lady, Quincy, Illinois. Signed, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith." End quote. This larger trend which this letter implies is Emma's increased involvement in the church affairs during the Nauvoo years. Prior to their settlement in Nauvoo, Emma's affiliation with the church had always been at an arm's length, allowing Joe to get into all kinds of trouble. Well, now, Emma had been burned so many times by Joe's bad decisions, and he'd missed the birth of their most recent child because he was in jail, that she began to take some power into her own hands. With Bloody Brigham and the rest of the 12 beginning their journey to England, a power vacuum was introduced once again, and Emma Smith tentatively stepped up to the plate. Quite soon after this, the earliest rendition of the Relief Society would be organized under the hand of Emma and Joe to create a structured female arm of the church, which had wholly been absent up to this point. This letter to Mr. and Mrs. Cleveland is made even more fascinating by the fact that Mr. Cleveland, after his time with the Mormons, would remain in Nauvoo not believing in Joseph and the church, with his wife, whose name was Sarah Marietta Kingsley Cleveland, who would later become one of Joe's polygamist wives. Luckily for Joe, Emma and him had decided on a plot in Nauvoo for them to live, which was adjacent to the plot on which Joe and Emma lived. That's really good for your communal wives. Some very fascinating developments will follow with Emma's increased involvement, but that's something that we're going to have to pick up on a little bit later. The next thing that Joe did was compile a list of complaints by which he could issue signed letters to the government addressing the grievances the Mormons had suffered. Joe and Hiram's complaints are included in the History of the Church, the Dan Vogel edition, starting on page 334. Now, I don't want to bother you, the listener, with all the details included in these complaints, as they just rehash everything we've discussed since the church moved to Missouri. So go listen back to episodes 40 through 50 to understand everything the Mormons had to deal with while they were living in Missouri. But what I will do is read the last paragraphs of these two complaint letters, listing the bill Joe and Hiram issued to the Missouri government for the grievances the Mormons suffered. Ask yourself if this sounds fair. Quote, Bill of damages against the state of Missouri on account of the sufferings and losses sustained therein. This is from Joseph's hand, by the way. The final paragraph says, The loss of property which I have sustained is as follows. Losses sustained in Jackson County, Daviess County, Caldwell County, including lands, houses, harnesses, hogs, cattle, etc., books and store goods, expenses while in bonds of monies paid out, expenses of moving out of the state, and damages sustained by false imprisonments, threatenings, intimidations, exposures, etc., etc., $100,000, end quote. And this is Hiram's complaint, quote, Suffering and damages sustained in Missouri being driven therefrom. And this is the last paragraph in his complaint. Since I have obtained my liberty, I feel my body broke down and my health very much impaired from the fatigue and afflictions which I have undergone, so that I have not been able to perform any labor since I have escaped from my oppressors. The loss of property which I sustained in the state of Missouri would amount to several $1,000s, and $100,000 would be no consideration for what I have suffered from privations, from my life being continually sought, and all the accumulated sufferings I have been subject to. End quote. So these were the two listed complaint letters that were included in the History of the Church, which Joe accumulated among a number of other letters of complaints from other prominent church leaders. All of these letters of complaint would be compiled into a nice little folder tucked under Joe's arm when he walked into Martin Van Buren's office to complain to him about the misdeeds of the Missouri government. And we're unfortunately going to have to pick up on that in a few episodes, as that doesn't happen for a little while. But first and foremost, an ancillary point made in the complaints is that Joe needed money. Once again, the church needed their money. So he began sending letters specifically to various friends and church members who may have been holding out, asking for their personal savings to secure the tracts of land. Now, this is a letter that Joe and Vincent Knight wrote to a man named Mark Bigler, who was a wealthy member who apparently still had some savings. This letter is indicative of many letters which Joe was writing to hopefully make the requirements for the down payments for all the land the church was eating up. But we're just going to read this one as it's indicative of a larger trend. Quote, Dear Sir, we have thought well to write to you by Brother Stephen Markham. Keep that name in mind, Stephen Markham, on the subject of our purchase of lands here, in order to stir up your pure mind to a remembrance of the situation in which we have been placed by the act of the councils of the church having appointed us a committee to transact business here for the church. We have, as is known to the church in general, made purchases and entered into contracts and promised payments of monies, for all of which we now stand responsible. Now, as money seems to come in too slowly, imagine that, In order that we may be able to meet our engagements, we have determined to call upon the liberality of Father Bigler through the agency of Brother Stephen Markham, and request that he will place in his hands a sum of $500 or $600, for which he shall have the security of said committee, also through the agency of Brother Stephen Markham, and the thanks of the church besides. Signed, Joseph Smith Jr. and Vincent Knight. End quote. Brother Stephen Markham was an interesting guy. Now, he just appeared on the scene when he was baptized into the church July 1837 in Kirtland, and was immediately appointed a supervisory position overseeing the saints' removal from Ohio, and subsequently from Missouri as well. He was a newcomer, and some people didn't trust Brother Stephen Markham, but Joe did, and thus put him in charge of running letters and collecting thousands of dollars for the church to pay the contracts Joe was signing in order to acquire land in Illinois and Iowa for the saints to settle on. In order to allay the concerns of the saints who may not have trusted Brother Stephen Markham, Joe wrote a public letter to be read aloud to the church as a congregation, giving Markham Joe's personal blessing so everybody else would trust him just as much as Joe did. This is the public address. Quote, "To the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, greeting. From our knowledge of the great sacrifices made by the bearer, Brother Stephen Markham, in belief of the welfare of us and the church generally, and from the great trust which we have oft times reposed in him, and as often found him trustworthy, not seeking his own aggrandizement, but rather that of the community, we feel warranted in commissioning him to go forth amongst the faithful as our agent to gather up and receive such moneys, in money or otherwise, as shall enable us to meet our engagements which are about to devolve upon us, in consequence of our purchases here for the church. And we humbly trust that our brethren generally will enable him to come to our assistance before our credit shall suffer on this account. Signed, Joseph Smith Jr., Presiding Elder." End quote. That was Joe's blessing, telling the entire church that, hey, we can trust this Stephen Markham guy. But Stephen Markham still made his flash appearance on the scene, as many people did, beginning in these Nauvoo years, which caused some distrust with some of those who had been around for over half a decade. But this was Joe's answer to their concerns. And from all I can tell, Joe made a good judgment call with Stephen Markham, as Markham would pass away in Spanish Fork, Utah, after having been appointed to lieutenant of the Nauvoo Legion and holding other important roles during his church career. But there were other people who were just starting to come out of the woodwork who would gain Joe's trust and blessing, who really didn't have the best interest of the saints in mind. For now, Joe and the saints were blessed with the good fortune of having Brother Stephen Markham and his undying devotion to the advancement of the Mormons' best interests. To give a little context of who Stephen Markham was, I'm going to read a few extracts from the biographical sketches of Stephen Markham from FamilySearch.org, and you can find a link for that in the show notes. This biography was recounted by one of his descendants who, let's just say it, took some historical liberties, but it tells us a bit about the man that I find rather fascinating. Quote, "His father was David Markham, and his mother was Dinah Mary Markham. His father was a Revolutionary soldier and was accidentally killed while celebrating on the 4th of July, 1802 or 1803, when Stephen was a little over 2 years old. His mother afterwards moved to the state of Ohio, where the family settled in Chester, Geauga County, Ohio. It was at this place that Stephen first heard the gospel and was baptized by Elder Abel Lamb in July 1837. He was well-to-do at the time, and sold all his possessions in Ohio by the counsel of the prophet Joseph Smith. He then furnished most of the money to prepare 60 souls for immigration, furnishing them with clothing, food, teams, and wagons for their move from Kirkland to Far West, Missouri. He having charge of them, after arriving at Far West, he was appointed an agent for the church to raise means and assist the poor saints in the days of trouble and persecution by the mobs in Missouri and Illinois." So that paragraph just described that Elder Markham was a well-to-do guy, wealthy in Ohio, and then sold all of his possessions at Joseph Smith's request to finance people's move from Kirtland to Missouri and then Missouri to Illinois. He's a really nice guy. Moneybags, nonetheless, but he's a nice guy. The biographical sketches continue saying, quote, "On the morning of the 9th, Elder Markham left Far West to take $100 sent by Elder Kimball to the prophet who was in jail, as they were destitute of means and their trial started that day before a drunken mob. Brother Markham was compelled to swim several streams and arrived in the afternoon. He spent the evening in the company of the prophet and his brothers." End quote. You know, someone like this who was constantly saddled with logistics and responsible for so much money at various intervals in Mormon history, and, might I add, with a last name ending in Ham, Stephen Markham will now be known to us as Piggy Bank Steve, marking our newest induction into the family of NaMo nicknames in our historical timeline. But, just like John Ratzenberger, Piggy Bank Steve didn't mess around when people would mess around with him. Back to his sketches, quote, "April 10th was spent examining witnesses for the trial. Brother Markham, Piggy Bank Steve, was not permitted to give his testimony that day, but the next day, the 11th of April, 1839, he gave his testimony, which was too truthful in case of the prisoner, and after he had closed, Blakely, one of the guards, told him he wanted to speak with him. Piggy Bank Steve went around the corner of the house when Blakely called out, 'You damned old Mormon, I'll kill you!' and struck at him with a fist and then a club. Piggy Bank Steve took the club from him and threw it over a fence. Then 10 of the mob immediately rushed upon him to kill him, but Brother Markham told him that he could kill the whole bunch with one blow apiece and drove them off. The court and grand jury saw the affair and heard the mob threaten Piggy Bank Steve's life with all the oaths they could invent, but they took no cognizance of it. The 10 men went home after their guns to shoot Brother Markham, but did not return." End quote. Piggy Bank Steve will be with us for quite some time, and he's a guy that we can trust to do the right thing when it comes to the advancement of the church and Joe's best interests. What could possibly go wrong with trusting one guy with thousands of dollars of church funds to fulfill its financial obligations? The next few entries in the history of the church happen rapid fire and were necessary for building up of the church's new Zion, soon to be designated Nauvoo. The most important entry we'll read, which brings us to the end of our historical timeline for today, comes from the Guilty Spark page of the History of the Church Dan Vogel edition, and it's a single line which had incredible ramifications for the rest of Mormon history. Quote, "June 11th, I commenced dictating my history for my clerk, James Mulholland, to write." End quote. When you've been doing a podcast on a single topic for a few years, it seems like so many different broad topics can boil down to a few important overarching points. One of those points I've boiled a ton of Mormon history down to is historical revisionism and the problem it creates. When Bloody Brigham took over the church after the 1844 schism, he began a massive campaign to reproduce the history of the church as he saw fit, incorporating tens of thousands of changes over the 7-volume set, meaning that entire paragraphs which were dictated straight from Joe's mouth were completely omitted, and paragraphs which Joe never said were incorporated and considered a part of his true history. As somebody who tries to understand real history as a pastime, a living, and an insatiable passion, historical revisionism is something with which I'm endlessly frustrated. Studying history is a constant joust between determining reliability of early accounts and appreciating broad historical models constructed decades or centuries after any given historical occurrence. The throwaway line of 20/20 historical hindsight is often used flippantly to claim that modern historical models are more accurate than early models because later on we have the ability to zoom out and broaden our scope and take many different factors into account. We're hopefully less influenced today by temporal issues of that time, by, the people who wrote it were influenced by. But that consideration also shouldn't disparage the reliability of something written much closer to a given historical event. When somebody like Joseph Smith dictates his own history, as Joe began in June of 1839, it's obvious that he had biases and motivations for doing so, as well as a vested interest in seeing the history recounted as he saw fit, in a way that would improve the narrative of the church history. Hingepin Sidney Rigdon and Matilda Spalding Davison had just gone through their public letter exchange resurrecting the underlying Spalding theory, and Joe saw it necessary to begin dictating his own history to counteract any controversy which may have arisen from the ashes of this PR nightmare. Joe's dictated history of the church began in direct response to the resurgence of the Spalding theory in the public eye merely 2 weeks prior from when he began dictating. And then, following this, beginning in November of 1839, that's a mere 5 months after Joe began his historical dictation, the Times and Seasons, which was the final church periodical that was established during Joe's lifetime, was established in Nauvoo, which would subsequently publish his history from 1842 to 1846. That history would undergo a systematic revision under Bloody Brigham Young, published in the Deseret News in Utah from 1851 to 1857, which underwent further historical revision under B.H. Roberts, published from 1902 to 1915. Every single edition of these church histories was published by some iteration of the church with an obvious vested interest and motivations to revise church history, to be told in a certain way. That is problematic historical revisionism. Finally, in 2015, Dan Vogel published his History of Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a source and text critical edition, which compiles every different version of the church histories and documents the source text, scribe, and changes of every single passage included in all 7 volumes of the history of the church. Dan Vogel lays bare the historical revisionism that has happened throughout every iteration of the history of the church, which is why I'm happy to rely on this 7-volume book set for the past few episodes and will continue to rely on it heavily throughout the rest of the Joseph Smith years of Mormon history. Vogel recounts all the historical revisionism that has been performed through every iteration of the history of the church, and does so without adding any editorial commentary as other historians are often wont to do. I can think of no greater example of historical revisionism than Joseph Smith's first vision account. From his first iteration, published in 1832, compared to the version published in the Times and Seasons in 1842, dozens of important foundational claims are wildly different concerning his first vision, and we see an evolution of the history through its various revisions, which follows that of other legends, meaning that the details seem to sharpen over time as opposed to becoming blurrier as with real memories. Joseph Smith's history has been revised by scores of people for a number of competing reasons, all with different motivations. As recently as 2011, a man named Christopher Nemelka wrote a book titled Without Disclosing My True Identity, the Authorized and Official Biography of the Prophet Joseph Smith, claiming to be inspired by the same mentors as those mentors who inspired Joseph Smith to write the Book of Mormon. I don't know who considers it an official biography or who authorized it, but that is the title of the book. Nemelka was somehow able to speak to, the reincarnation of Joseph Smith or something, and then give his official biography from his own deceased mouth. I mean, that's kind of the premise of the book, and I have yet to read it, but from my understanding, it's just a very fanciful version of Joseph's history, rife with historical inaccuracies, claiming to explain Joseph Smith's motivation for writing the Book of Mormon in the first place, something that nobody could ever truly know. But every example so far exhibited is a cancerous version of historical revision, becoming steadily more malignant through each iteration, distorting the understanding of Joe's history in those who believe the claims of each different version of church history. It's good that we have true historians like Dan Vogel who call out the historical revisionism and show us exactly when and where each revision took place. But I was, however, recently introduced to a concept which I'd not considered before, which forces me to take pause and reconsider every soapbox I've mounted against historical revisionism. And this realization came as a product of a conversation that I had with a history professor, which you're going to be listening to momentarily. But Professor CJ made the point that revising historical models is absolutely necessary to keep historical studies relevant and accepted models accurate. And it occurred to me that right now I'm amidst a campaign of historical reporting which revises Mormon history in my own way. My favorite thing to do on this show is to present a given topic from the pro and then the anti-Mormon side, then give my take on the topic and simply ask you as a listener to skepticize it and figure out what makes sense to you. I trust you as a listener to exercise the mental faculties available to us all in order to get as close to the truth as possible. But I could be poisoning the well with the false dichotomies and not even know it. In my reporting of Mormon history, I try and revise and construct naked Mormon history to what makes the most sense for me, which can unfortunately lead down a path which may get us further away from the historical truth, but hopefully gets us closer. It's just important to check our own biases and logically fallacious infractions against historical truths as often as possible. To show how good historical revision can be, Fawn Brody's seminal work, No Man Knows My History, revised so much of what the general public knew about Mormon history, the majority of which was only known by a small subsect of Mormon historians, but was hidden away from the general believing population, as the historians thought that the reality would conflict with the believer's faith. Now, the millions of people who've read her book understand a revised version of Mormon history, which was revised to better reflect reality. In real historical studies, revision is necessary as new information is brought to light or new interpretations of the existing evidence are introduced. If not for Fawn Brody's historical revision, millions of people may never have known about Joe's career as an occult magician prior to the Book of Mormon, or that he used the same seer stone that he used for hunting buried treasure to dictate the Book of Mormon out of a goddamn top hat. My point is, historical revision is a powerful tool. And just like fire that can cook your food and heat your home just as easily as burn your home to the ground, historical revision is a tool that should be wielded with accuracy and restraint. When motivated storytelling gets in the way of reporting historical facts, we need to recognize it for what it really is: lying for the Lord. Here to talk history and American politics, along with a bit about the importance of accurate and reasonable historical revision, is a man who gets just as frustrated with bullshit history as I do and has a podcast devoted to telling the dangerous version of history. You're going to hear half of the interview on the show today, and if you want to hear the full conversation, you can either listen to it through patreon.com/nakedmormonism, or you can go listen to this conversation on his Dangerous History podcast feed, where you're going to hear the uncut version of our conversation. And, while you're there, you might as well subscribe to his show. Without further ado, here's today's interview. All right, today we are joined by Professor CJ from the Dangerous History podcast and also a full-time college history professor. CJ, how you doing today, man?
Very good. Good to talk to you.
You as well. Thank you for coming on. For those of the listeners who don't know what Dangerous History is, both the podcast and the idea, can you give us an introduction to what you do and what the real idea of Dangerous History is?
Yeah, well, I'll try. I mean, it's kind of a complicated thing that has, I guess, more than one kind of interpretation or application. But basically, what I found as I learned history, and I've been looking at history intently since I was in my early teens. My family thought I was a weirdo for this, but I was the kid lugging home a pile of big nonfiction books from the library every other day, and then pursued it in college, got a bachelor's and a master's degree in it. And what I found from all that was that a lot of what really happened is different from what a lot of people think. Even people, now obviously you and I both know there's a lot of people just walking around on the street who just don't know a damn thing about history at all.
And couldn't care less.
Yeah. But they're not as big of a problem because it's sort of like the old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, that old Dunning-Kruger effect.
Exactly. It's the people who, used to watch a little bit of History Channel back when they had history on that channel.
Yeah, the bastion of verifiability it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Back before it turned into all ancient aliens and Cajuns and ice road truckers all the time. And the people who've read maybe some real books, but they're not very good books. They're kind of written by hacks like Doris Kearns Goodwin or somebody. That there's a whole ton of history that even people who consider themselves fairly informed on history are just clueless about. And that these things are dangerous in a whole bunch of different ways because they make you ask questions, they make you doubt, they make it harder for you to be manipulated and all that sort of thing. And so my podcast is very kind of wide ranging in terms of topic and time period. I'm all over the place because I'm kind of all over the place in my interests. I like to just sort of follow the thread of something, follow the muse. And so I guess the one thing that unites it is I'm kind of always skeptical about power. I'm always skeptical about the kind of standard establishment narrative, whatever that might be. And so, yeah, I just decided, you know what, I think more people need to hear this than just the 30 kids sitting in one of my classes. And besides that, the stuff I teach is just, U.S. history, world history. I can't go for 3 hours on like one particular topic that I find interesting that week, much as I would want to. And so my show kind of fills that need for me.
I really like that interpretation because history is a very powerful thing, and often it's said that history belongs to the victor. Eloquence belongs to the conqueror. They write their story. They write their own narrative. History is made from the inside, as it's so often said. So challenging that and trying to get down to the baseline facts of what really happened, I think that is where history goes from being just the standard textbook history to the dangerous side. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you did an episode, I guess this was probably 3 or 4 months back now. And I think initially you aired it as just a Patreon-only episode, but then you kicked it over to the regular feed because it was such a good episode where you talked about the ideal behind chasing dangerous history. Because there's the history that we're told that our founding fathers were these white knights and that they were so, amazing and righteous and that they were ideologues and that they had these amazing motivations. But when we get down to the fundamental points of it, the dangerous history version of them is a lot more fascinating than the version that we read in our high school textbooks.
Yeah, that episode, I think was called something like Dangerous History and Personal Liberation. And I put that together, kind of my thoughts, because honestly, a lot of dangerous history is kind of depressing because you're destroying people's fairy tales essentially. And, it is kind of a downer sometimes to really kind of show just how not happy endings a lot of this stuff is and how often the good guys don't really win and honestly how often there aren't really good guys at all. And
oh yeah.
So, I kind of put that together as my antidote to, I don't want people to get the impression that I'm simply being downbeat because I'm being downbeat, or that I'm destroying people's fairy tales because it's fun. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's amusing anyway, but...
And deserved as well.
Yeah. I mean, it needs to be done, but it's not... let me put it this way. I wish some of the rosier fairy tales about history were true.
Oh, right.
Because, things would be a bit better if they were in some ways. But to me, the idea is that when you believe in things that are just fairy tales that are designed to kind of manipulate you, that ultimately that prevents you from kind of, for lack of a better term, living up to your own potential. And kind of the more that you see things for what they really are, the more you can then act in ways that actually will make more sense to kind of liberate yourself.
There you go. I run into this all the time, and it does go to like the fairy tales that people often believe in when it comes to their history. I enjoy studying history because we have to compare accounts, and this is widely something of American history that I've been exposed to, so that's the perspective I'm speaking from. But I am interested in always seeing one version of a history and then seeing it slowly change over time to morph into become the narrative that we speak of today. And this happens often in not only with the Founding Fathers history, but in religious history, where you see they are actively revising history from one version of a story to another version that's only 2 or 3 years later. And you can see kind of the motivations behind revising that history. And this is a soapbox I oftentimes jump on and shout from the rooftops that I get frustrated with is what happens when we revise history is we're changing reality. We have to try and get down to the fundamentals of what makes history actually history. And when we're trying to parse through all of the revision, especially going further and further back where literacy rates and general people recounting their own stories drop significantly, it's really hard to parse out what really happened because as was said earlier, history always belongs to the victor in this case.
Yeah, I would take a little bit different take on some of what you're saying in that I would say that history actually, I don't think, is what actually happened. I think that history is people later trying to come up with a depiction of what happened. And the difference is subtle and important in terms of it's the difference between a thing itself and a picture or a description that's trying to represent it. Now, the picture or the description ideally would get as close to the thing as possible, unless it's supposed to be modern art or something. But that the picture or the description can never quite be the thing, although the goal is to, at least theoretically, to get it as accurate of a representation as possible. So I don't think that all revisionism is bad. My view is
interesting.
It depends on why it's being revised and kind of what's being done. So, for example, I think one that very few people would disagree with is if new information comes to light that wasn't known previously, then revision is appropriate.
Fair, yeah.
And another would be if new perspectives are taken into account on something that weren't taken into account before, that
Fair.
Revision might be appropriate. So, I mean, I did an episode on this early on that kind of, some forms of revisionism I think are appropriate. It kind of depends on why they're being done and how they're being done and so forth.
Well, I guess maybe I'm more motivated against revisionist with a capital R in this case. So the people who try and rally for changes in the Texas history books about who our founding fathers were and what they did, revising the history so that it paints this rosy picture and it creates these fairy tales. I'm just as skeptical of basically any historical narrative that I read based on who made that narrative, right? And I think you described it well. Revising narratives and revising historical models is important because we have to construct historical models in order to understand the history, because we're only looking at snapshots and trying to construct a narrative around that. So revising those based on new evidence, that is necessary, but the idea of ideologically revising something because there are motivations to paint a prettier picture than what actually happened, that's what I take issue with.
Yeah, certainly, I don't support the kind of revisionism where people are kind of deliberately falsifying records or being deliberately kind of lying by omission, for example, leaving out pieces of information that contradict their narrative, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's
why I say, to me, there's good revisionism and there's bad revisionism. It kind of depends on what's being done and why.
Touche to that. So let me ask you, Professor CJ, I want to get to something that I'm trying to figure out for myself here, and maybe you can shed some light on this. What is it about history that's so fascinating to you? I mean, obviously you had a drive from a very young age, as you told us. What was it that really got you involved in it so much and caught your eye?
Well, it's hard to say whether, it's one of these things, nature or nurture. Like, why are some people just kind of curious and kind of skeptical and contrarian? I guess I'm just sort of wired up that way. And the way I look at it is, when you're born into this life, you're dropped into a very interesting TV series that's already on like season 8,000. And I mean, can you imagine being dropped into, I don't know, Game of Thrones or something, assuming it ever runs that many seasons, right? And you're looking around and what you're seeing is pretty interesting, but at the same time, if you're the curious type, you have to ask yourself, well, how did it get to this? What the hell did the Lannisters and everybody do before? How did it get to this point? And so that's how it is to me. I mean, I see history in the same way that a person who's really into Lord of the Rings sees Lord of the Rings, or people really into Game of Thrones sees Game of Thrones. Where if you're dropped in thousands of years into it, you have to ask yourself, well, what got it to this point? So to me, I don't know. I'm just kind of weird. I have a hard time understanding people who don't find it interesting. Who don't look around the world today and go, oh, wait a minute. Just to pick a few random examples, how did the Middle East get as screwed up as it? Like, why is it that way? It can't just be something in the water, Yeah, right. Or why is the United States the way it is? In both good ways and bad ways. Whatever it might be.
Yeah. Because there isn't really a start or an end point to any given narrative, right? I mean, I made this mistake when I started the podcast. I said, okay, yeah, let's say Serial Mormon History Podcast. All right, we're going to start with the birth of Joseph Smith, because where else do you start with when it comes to Mormonism? Well, it turns out, Joseph Smith and the Smith family and many of the religions in the Burned Over District, well, I should say all of the religions in the Burned Over District, were heavily influenced by the time and place in which they arose. I mean, you can't understand Campbellite theology without having some sort of foundation in knowledge in the European iterations of the Protestant Christianities that were coming across the ocean. I mean, you can't understand some of the finer points of like. Let's say here's a random example of a 3-tiered heaven system without understanding that it derived from Swedenborgianism and prior to that even. So it's hard to understand any single individual inside of a world where you don't have to, go back a few hundred years to understand how the world got to where it was in order to foster the growth of somebody like a Joseph Smith or of an Andrew Jackson or of somebody who we consider a great man in history. So I guess that's kind of the interplay between the great man theory and the tides and forces theory of history, because it's an interplay of the two.
Yeah, and this problem of where to drop the needle on a particular story, and the problem of you want to talk about one thing and then you realize you need to do a ton on the what led up to it and the context and so on. We might call this the Dan Carlin problem, I guess. Any of us who do history podcasting, it's like, anytime you intend to tell a story about one particular thing, it's always the danger that you realize, oh man, before I get to that, I have to do 19 hours of of the backstory. I mean, I myself just recently, like literally in the past few days, finished up an episode about how the Florida Everglades got drained of all things. And it's an interesting story that I've wanted to tell for a while, but the funny part is I wasn't originally intending to do that right now. I was intending to just do a story about the rise of the so-called sugar barons, who are the very powerful special interests in Florida who grow sugar under all sorts of government protection and subsidy and so on. And
Interesting.
And then I was like, well, you know what? If I want to tell the story of these guys, like I can't not tell the story of how their sugarcane kingdom got literally created, by getting the U.S. government to come in and drain the place in the first place. So, that's just a recent example, but yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah, and I guess that does get to the fundamental point of researching any history, right? Is where exactly do we begin the story? Because a history is compelling when you understand it through the story or the individuals who progressed through a given storyline. Whereas I personally take issue with like my history education in junior high and high school, because I was never interested in history during those years. It took me leaving the structured education history and studying dangerous history, pardon the borrowing of the term, but it took me studying dangerous history and actual stories of these people in order to get interested, because I wasn't interested in memorizing names and dates and big battles. It's so much more compelling to latch onto somebody, and this is the way that we tell all stories in a movie or in a comic book strip or in any book. We have to grab onto a certain small subsect of individuals or one hero or anti-hero and follow them as they progress through whatever happened in their life. And that's the way that we learn and truly comprehend history. And I guess maybe one of the most useful reasons for studying history is that oftentimes the stories that we learn and these people that we study, they're awfully analogous to things that are going on today. We can look at a past president, or we can look at a past religious leader or whatever and say, wow, that's awfully analogous to what's happening today. I wonder if what happened back then is going to happen now, or something to that effect. It's a very rich understanding, and it's more of a holistic understanding of reality, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of just the general concept of cyclical history for a long, long time. And, not that I believe that like history repeats itself super closely to what happened before, but that there's clearly kind of repeating motifs and rhythms and that sort of thing. Things that tend to recur roughly every, so many years or whatever, approximately. And it's when you're given the version that it's just sort of like one damn thing after another, kind of disconnected bits of trivia questions and that sort of thing. I mean, it robs a lot of the life out of it, I think.
That being said, I do want to take kind of a hard shift with you here, CJ, because we share, I think, a mutual interest in American history and 19th century, specifically American history. And I say that confidently because I have an interest in all history, but I have only been studying fervently this small subsect of history. So I feel like this is a place where we could intersect a little bit. I want to talk to you about the Great Awakening periods throughout American history, as well as kind of the overarching politics that were going on during these times, because there's so much there's just so much to parse through here, but it's fun to talk about even at a theoretical level with somebody who shares this level of perspective. And specifically, I want to talk to you about your opinions on what kind of incited the let's just say the beginning of this first Great Awakening. What in your perspective do you think kind of led to this being called a Great Awakening, and what exactly does that mean?
Well, the original, or the first Great Awakening, was way back, kind of a little bit before the American Revolution era, and people argue about different factors that cause big social movements to happen. And I think I'm always skeptical of any kind of like single monolithic explanation where it's like, well, it's this one change that's what caused it. To me, there's always a bunch of different ingredients that kind of go into the stew. But one of them, I think, is that, and I just did a podcast episode about this recently, this idea of generations being maybe an interesting paradigm through which to think about history. And it seems like there are pretty regularly kind of religious or spiritual revival sort of movements in America, and they seem to happen kind of at a pretty regular interval of roughly 80 years or so, which is kind of interesting.
Okay.
And so I think that a big part of it, not the only thing, but a big part of why these things happen is that generations react to what's come before. And there seems to be this pendulum throughout American history, and there are pendulums going on a lot of different kind of topics, but one of them where there seems to be this pendulum swinging back and forth almost like clockwork is religiosity. And so you'll have a few generations where religion's kind of a little bit declining in importance, and there's still some people really into it, but in general people are a little less into it, and they might go to church, but they're just kind of going through the motions sort of a thing. It's more of a social thing. And then you'll have a couple generations after that where suddenly it becomes, much more passionate and emotional, and there's literally revivals happening, etc. And so what you find with the First Great Awakening is that it's a reaction to, you had the original generation of kind of Puritan founders of a lot of the northeastern colonies, and they came over like fired up with religious passion. We're going to make our city on a hill and have this Puritan utopia, etc. Mm-hmm. And a few generations go by, and you find there's both subjective and objective evidence that maybe not the kids, but the grandkids and great-grandkids of those Puritan founders, they're just not into it, right? They're more interested in running their business, running their farm, building a better life, that sort of thing. And, church attendance goes down, and even those who do go, it's kind of like I said, more sort of going through the motions. And then after a few generations of that,
it resets back to it goes back to the firebrands.
Exactly.
They take back over. Interesting.
Exactly. So that's what you see, I think, in the First Great Awakening is a reaction against a few generations of, and it's mostly in the Northeast where it starts, both in the First and Second Great Awakening. It's the Northeast.
Yeah, I wonder what your take is on that. Why specifically in that area? Is that just because that was where, the most immigration was happening? That's where they had the most cultural stew happening, the most, the broadest perspectives, the most education, or what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think part of it goes all the way back to the Puritan founding, that in the Northeast, especially New England, you find more of the colonies that were founded for explicitly religious purposes. Whereas, it's kind of counterintuitive because we think of the South as being, the Bible Belt and the more religious part of the country, but really that wasn't the case up through about maybe the aftermath of the Civil War, really for colonial history and right on up through, the Civil War. The South was actually, believe it or not, in a lot of ways you could say less religious than the North.
That surprises me, but that only surprises me because I'm looking at it with my modern day perspective. So it shouldn't surprise me, I should say. Yeah.
Well, it surprised me when I first learned it, but in a way it kind of makes sense because if you look back at the founding of the colonies in the 17th and early 18th century, you find that the southern colonies were usually founded along more of kind of earthly purposes. They were just like, let's make some money by growing some rice, or hey, let's make some money by growing some tobacco. That'll be good.
Right.
And the people who came over, it was more that motivation. It was more of an economic motivation. It was people who didn't have enough opportunity in England or like, hey, I can come to Virginia and maybe make some money. Whereas if you look at especially Massachusetts, but also some of the other northeastern colonies, from day one, they have a utopian Christian mission to found version of an earthly utopia. And so
restore the church,
yeah.
Right? Or restore it to its former glory, whatever that is.
Yeah, make it great again. Sure.
Nice and present. Thank you for that.
I couldn't resist that one, but I think that's part of why you find the First and Second Great Awakening being a northern thing, is that they're the descendants of people who founded those colonies back when they were colonies for explicitly religious purposes. And so, I don't know if it's in their DNA maybe, but they just have more of that sense. Now, I think and both of the first two Great Awakenings, they certainly did touch the South. They, it's not like they didn't affect the South, but not as much as the North. Yeah,
and I was going to say, it almost sounds like they affected it through osmosis, through missionary work more than anything. It didn't seem like any of these awakenings really, spawned out of the South. It was like they started up in the North, and then they sent missionaries everywhere in the world they possibly could.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting in the South, because on the one hand, you do have a lot of people who get converted to these evangelical faiths. On the other hand, before the Civil War, they always have the problem of, if they embrace all of the radical evangelical kind of egalitarian impulses in the movement, then that has problematic implications for the institution of slavery. So they always have this thing where they're kind of like, oh yeah, this is great, let's go to church, and eventually they even are like, yeah, it'd be great if we can get our slaves to be Christians, that'll work. But yeah, right. But they always have to stop short of, like, following it all the way down the road towards what led to abolitionism up in the Northeast. But I think what makes the South eventually become more religious is the trauma and defeat and destruction of the Civil War. I think that's really where you see the South start to become more religious than it had been, and then eventually pull ahead.
Yeah, and was that just, I mean, kind of coming out of the era of Reconstruction, where they had missionary groups from northern missions going out and helping to reconstruct these areas and proselytizing at the same time? Do you think that had any impact on it?
Yeah, I think it did. And it's kind of interesting, because you would assume that Southerners would then want to reject that kind of attitude as being the outsiders, but it seems like they kind of caught the bug, because by the 1890s is when the South starts to become really kind of evangelical in its Christianity. And what's funny is, a lot of what we think of as Southern evangelical Christianity, really, if you go back before the Civil War, that's a Northeastern thing. That's a thing you find in New England, upstate New York, Northern Illinois. That's not something that was largely indigenous to the South. So they kind of caught the bug somehow.
Yeah, whether it was through missionary work, or who knows, maybe it was just one of these tides and forces of society that we can't necessarily point to any small group of causes. It just sort of evolved out of necessity, and now we see where that has led to today, where they seem to hold on to that firebrand puritanical type of religiosity, or at least that's kind of the narrative that we see. But maybe that's not entirely accurate, because each individual person may be much less religious than their next door neighbor, but it seems to come out in the aggregate that they are more religious down in the Bible Belt, thus being called the Bible Belt for a reason.
It's very weird and complicated when you zoom in on because there's always the disconnect too between what people say they believe and what their actions show they really believe, so.
Yeah, that's the truth as well. But I want to take that kind of and dovetail off of this conversation and go into the Second Great Awakening, because that's kind of where the focus of this podcast, Naked Mormonism, lies, is where Joseph Smith grew up, and the incredibly the burned over district, as it was known by, I cannot remember the name of the guy that created the burned over district. He coined the term in like the 1860s or 70s or something, but it was basically there was no fuel left to burn because the religious fires had burned through it so many times. And that's where Mormonism gets its start. That's where Campbellite Baptists get their start. That's where the Millerites and the Seventh-day Adventists get their start. That's where so many of these quintessential American religions really began, was out of the burned over district in, Western New York area. What is your take on the burned over district, and how do you think that it kind of came to be?
Yeah, well, my understanding of it is that there have been some historians fairly recently who've kind of looked back through various records and have argued that the burned over district wasn't quite as unique as we think it was.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit here that I've not done enough digging into that question to have an educated opinion. My gut is that, maybe you can look through church records and different things and say, look, there's a spike in religiosity in these other places too. But on the other hand, the fact is it seems like more new things, not just, people getting, fired up for religion again and going to church in bigger numbers, but like genuinely new religious movements starting from scratch, or obviously they're usually built on Christianity, but basically new takes on it, right? That more of those things clearly come out of Western New York than anywhere else at the time. And so I think there's some truth to it.
And it seems like what the religions that did crop up out of that area kind of have the longevity that other religions cropping up out of other areas don't. These religions are still around, whereas like the religions that typically or that we kind of tend to typify in other areas, like these small cults of like the Ephrata cloister and the Oneida group and the Rosicrucians and whatnot, that didn't actually come out of the burned over district. We don't really hear much from those anymore, but I mean, the Methodists and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Mormons and all of these other religions, they still stuck around. I wonder if there's anything that we can point to that might have to do with the longevity of these specific religions.
Yeah, I don't know, but it seems like there are some. By the way, I think it was. I could be wrong. I think it was Charles Finney who coined the term burned over district.
Yes, that is correct. Yes, Charles Finney. Thank you.
Yeah, who's, I guess, kind of one of the founders of what's called New School Presbyterianism, which Presbyterianism kind of split at that point into the more evangelical side, which is called New School, and then the more kind of traditional, less emotional side that was known as Old School back then. But the fact that somebody like Charles Finney would say, hey, there was just something particular about these western counties of New York that really were kind of a fertile ground for revivalism. Like, I think, you have to take into account, when you're trying to figure out history, you have to take into account kind of non-quantifiable subjective information to some extent, I mean,
okay.
It doesn't mean that you don't take it with a grain of salt and you don't kind of cross-check it and whatever. But on the other hand, the fact that a leading revivalist minister of the time period said that this was kind of a special place for all this stuff, to me that should be given some weight.
Well, I think that's fair, but and it could also have been his subjective experience. But I guess when we zoom far enough out and we see the religions that have lasted since then that Charles Finney was exposed to and was preaching around, because I guess there may be something to it. And I want to go back to what you said, and pardon me here, I'm just taking this off of a Wikipedia article, so take that with a big grain of salt. But in the burned over district of the Second Great Awakening, it talks about Linda Pritchard. This is a quote from the article, quote, uses statistical data to show that compared to the rest of New York State, the Ohio River Valley, in the lower Midwest, and the country as a whole, the religiosity of the burned over district was typical rather than exceptional. So, I mean, maybe it is kind of a newer school of thought that what was going on in the burned over district wasn't specific to just that area, but it was, kind of more of indicative of the broader trend of religiosity in the area, or in the broader area. But I don't know if you have, I'm kind of compelled by what you said earlier, CJ, is if you have Charles Finney, who's a preacher, at the time saying that there's something weird about this area, maybe there's something special to that. I don't know. I don't know what to make of all of it.
Sure, and like you said, when you tick off the list of kind of new religions that get started there, I mean, it's pretty impressive as far as not just new religions, but new religions that in many cases end up sticking around for a while. And what I find very interesting is the area that they talk about as the burned over district. Essentially, it coincides with the path of the Erie Canal.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about that too, because that was a boom to that area.
Yeah, that was a big deal. I mean, that was the equivalent of like getting the first, big highway built through your area or something. I mean, that was huge.
Yeah, Rochester exploded when that happened. I mean, they finished it in what was it, 26? I think it was.
Yeah, something like that. And I don't think it's a coincidence, number one, the timing, right? Which, some people date the Second Great Awakening as starting way back in the 1790s. To me, that's being a bit too expansive with it. I think kind of 1820s is really when it's really kind of up and going.
I wonder if they're wrapping in the Campbellites into that, because Alexander Campbell kind of really began his preaching in kind of it was about the mid 1790s where the Campbellism started to become a real thing. So I wonder if just wrapping him up specifically into it draws that time frame out towards the 1790s instead of just being localized towards like the 1810s, 1820s.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking on it, and maybe people much more expert on this specific area than I am who disagree, but I've always gotten the impression that the real heart of the Second Great Awakening was kind of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. That that's really when it's into its own. And yeah, you can find earlier movements and earlier things that are kind of like precursors to it, but it's sort of like you could say, yeah, the beatniks of the 1950s in some ways were anticipating the counterculture of the 60s and 70s. Yeah. But, I don't think we would say that the 60s counterculture started in 1955 then,
Yeah, that gets back to something we said earlier. Where do you drop that pin, right?
Yeah, I mean, nothing is ever created from scratch or whatever. But, if I'm right that the kind of real heart of the Second Great Awakening is the 1820s through about the 1840s, then it is kind of interesting, number one, that coincides with the construction and completion of the Erie Canal, and number two, that the area that is the most often thought of as the heart of the Second Great Awakening happens to be the exact same place that the Erie Canal went through.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems like too much of a coincidence to say that there's not some sort of a either cause and effect, or at the very least influence sort of a relationship going on there.
There's some level of correlation between the two, because once that does happen, you have an incredible amount of trade that's opened up all across the Great Lakes area. You have missionaries making their way across vast areas where they would have had to take, walking or horse and buggy prior. Oh, they just hop on a ferry for a day and then they're, 100 miles away. It was an incredible time, an incredible advent or augmentation to this small frontier area. And when you have it, like you said, you build a first massive highway in a small town, the economy explodes for a short time. And, it ebbs and flows, it fluctuates, of course, but that initial explosion is, I think, kind of what we see with the Erie Canal and the burned over district, because that is the perfect area for it to happen.
Yeah, it's destabilizing when people suddenly experience a significant amount of change in a short period of time. And, today in the first world of the present, we are so accustomed to constant change and innovation and so on that we almost take it for granted, that in 5 years, technology is going to be exponentially beyond what it is right now. But, thinking in terms of 200 years ago, it wouldn't take nearly as much change to knock you off balance and really kind of, throw a monkey wrench into everyone's way of thinking and everyone's kind of social institutions. And, people tend to react against things when they happen. At least some people do. And people, one of the places that people have historically gone to when they feel maybe uneasy or not even always necessarily uneasy, but simply a little bit weird, for lack of a better term, in the face of significant change, is people often tend to turn to religion. And they'll sometimes turn to, like, let's go back to the old ways, but they'll also very often, even if they're saying that, very often what they're actually doing is innovating, So what people often describe as fundamentalism, and they're passing it off as we're returning to the old ways, very often they're not really. They're doing their own kind of nouveau version of it.
Let's take that as a good jump-off point, because I want to get into another massive factor that played into the Second Great Awakening, if we are to grant the time frame of the 1820s to the 40s, and that is the presidency of Andrew Jackson, a very fascinating president of our great union. And I want to talk about your thoughts on how much Jackson was trying to innovate politically speaking, because he did some things that were seen as aberrations to some people. The Indian Removal Act, I think, is a fantastic example of that. He essentially caused the Panic of 1837, among a myriad of many other things that he did in his presidency that may have caused some people, as you said, to be destabilized and, cause them to run back to their religions as their safety net, basically. So what is it? Let me just leave a broad, open question there. What do you think Andrew Jackson's role and the role of politics was in kind of the religiosity of the area?
That's an interesting question. I tend to see it more as the religion influences the politics than the other way around, but then, of course, once the religion influences the politics, then I suppose the politics could then in turn influence the religion.
Fair.
But
an endless ebb and flow, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Jackson is very, very complex and contradictory in a lot of ways. He apparently seems to have seen himself as kind of like almost the next Thomas Jefferson, and yet if you look at his actual actions during his presidency, a lot of the things he actually did were very un-Jeffersonian, especially in regards to the nullification crisis, where he basically threatened to invade South Carolina. In general, what Jackson innovated on, and by the way, I think Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive when Jackson was starting to rise through the system, I think Thomas Jefferson actually called Andrew Jackson a very dangerous man or something.
He didn't even know.
Yeah, which kind of interesting, but Jackson, what in some ways what his innovation was that I find kind of troubling is he in some ways was the first president to have this idea of the president in particular and the executive branch in general being more equal than the other two branches of the constitutional system. So Jackson's the first guy who, in the things he said and the things he did, you start to see what becomes really kind of the presidency as we have known it for the last century or so, which is this notion that, yeah, we have three branches of government with checks and balances, but the presidency and the executive branch are special, and they get to be more equal than the others.
Yeah.
So Jackson, he articulated it in the way where he said, look, I'm the only person who's elected to office by the nation at large, by the voters at large.
Well, and he was one of those kind of early grassroots type of politicians, because I think a lot of people liked him so much because he wasn't a politician. He was just running off of his military merits. And people were like, yeah, an unexperienced guy in the highest office of government in our country, that's a great idea.
Yeah, and he's definitely an unpredictable loose cannon. I mean, I think it's fortunate that we didn't have nukes back when back when Jackson was president, because I could definitely see him. I mean, he's literally a guy who killed people in duels before he became president. So
yeah. I was going to say, yeah. I mean, generations of Native Americans today would be suffering from thyroid cancer. I mean, that's just how it would have happened.
Yeah, I mean, I could just see him like, one morning gets pissed off at something, some foreign government said to him or whatever, and just, all right, let's do this,
Pray to God that never happens, ever happens. Yeah. But still, I mean, yeah, obviously he did seem to capture that grassroots type of, what we see as like the backcountry blue state Democrats, these Jacksonian Democrats, where they wanted to get somebody in that was a man of the people. And, well, I mean, obviously his presidency was met with mixed successes, depending on who you were and on which side of his presidency you happened to be. Obviously, I don't think the Native Americans liked him very much.
No, not at all, and for good reason. And I actually, a long time ago, did some episodes on my show about the Seminole Wars, a bit of Florida history, which I know well because I live in Florida. And he played a key role in the First Seminole War, which is where the United States invaded Spanish Florida and took it over. And he was the main general in charge of that military operation at the time. And then the Second Seminole War in the 1830s and 40s, he was president. And that was in response to Indian removal, where one of the tribes he was trying to move were the Seminole Indians in Florida, and the Seminole Indians decided they were willing to fight to stay where they were. And actually turned into the longest, most expensive Indian war in American history, and one that very few people even know about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely ignorant on it. This is interesting. I'll have to look into it more.
Yeah, and I'll just say this about my very early episodes. My audio quality is often crap.
It's the content that matters.
That's what I always say. I stand by the content. Just don't expect my early episodes to have very great production value. I was literally learning this by doing it.
Yeah, I think that's the case for most podcasters. So, but I will say, the Dangerous History Podcast definitely has my shining recommendation. I definitely enjoy it. If people want to go onto your show, what are they going to hear if they click onto one of the more recent episodes? You talked about draining the swamp in Florida and the Everglades there. Have you finished up your Not So Civil War series yet?
No, that is on pause.
Okay.
Simply because of the amount of research going into it, and honestly, I periodically get kind of burned out on it because I've been doing so much research and reading and so on the Not So Civil War that every now and then I have to just kind of, okay, let me talk about something else for a little while. But I am going to be getting back to that again soon. By the way, one thing that kind of hooks into what we've been talking about is the Second Great Awakening has an impact on the zealotry of some of the people on the Union side, where they ultimately endorse, total war and targeting civilians and so on.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, all you have to do, I'm trying to remember, it's either part 1 or part 2 of my Civil War series where I talk about the song Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yes.
Which, I mean, talk about a Second Great Awakening, religious sort of a hymn, right?
I'm going to have to, because I sang that so many times in church, I'm going to have to go back and read that hymn again with understanding a little bit more of the politics, because I'm sure that would definitely change the meaning for me quite a bit.
Yeah, I just pulled it up to check. It was episode 131 of my podcast, which was actually part 1 of my Civil War series. At the end of it, I talk a bit about Battle Hymn of the Republic, and basically I see it as a hymn of kind of total war, where it's just like, all right, God's on our side, so let's completely just mercilessly lay waste to our enemies and everything.
And send them on a trail of tears and whatnot. But you're talking more Civil War era. I guess I'm still kind of hung up on Jacksonian stuff, but
just anybody who's interested in how kind of religiosity affects the Civil War. The book to read is called Upon the Altar of the Nation. It's one I've referred to a lot in my Civil War series. Upon the Altar of the Nation by Harry Stout. Very interesting book. But other than the Civil War, yeah, I mean, I just did one about the draining of the Everglades just for something different. I'm going to be doing one about the rise of the so-called sugar barons, or Big Sugar in Florida, kind of building off of that. And going to be getting back to the Civil War. My next Civil War episode, I'm working on a Patreon supporters one, right, for the just the people who support my show on Patreon, and that one's going to be part 2 of, I've been doing stuff about the naval aspects of the Civil War for my Patreon supporters.
Very cool.
Yeah, which is largely unknown but very important.
Yeah, we hear about the land battles, but yeah, that of course the naval battles definitely played a part into it, and supply lines and everything as well.
Yeah. I mean, the South's economy was so tied into import-export that by being able to dominate the seas, that was really, in a lot of ways, probably the most important thing to the long-term Union victory, was strangling the South's economy that way. And I got another one I'm working on for the relatively near future on the Civil War. That'll be a regular episode, not a Patreon one. That will be, I'm calling it the Grunt's Eye Perspective. So I'm going to really zero in hard on the experience of the war from the perspective of the common soldier and kind of the low-level officer as well. What was it really like? What would you experience, if you joined one of these armies during this war? And basically, the short version is, it's not good. It's not pretty. It's not romantic.
Yeah, no. Of course not. Yes, definitely going to look forward to that. So if people want to find Dangerous History and your Patreon page, where can they find you, CJ?
Well, my website, if you just type in dangeroushistorypodcast.com, you'll get to my homepage, and I'm on all the usual podcast venues, and so just search Dangerous History Podcast on iTunes, and Patreon.com/PROFCJ is the Patreon page, which of course I link to from my homepage as well. So yeah, that's where they can check it out. And, I hope some of your listeners will give me a listen.
Absolutely. And of course there will be links in the show notes for everything. And, any time that I can get a historian to come on the show and talk about American history that I know, I'm all over it. So, I'm really glad we got in touch, and I look forward to possibly having you on in the future. It's been a fun conversation today.
Well, thanks very much. Be happy to come back on anytime.
Awesome. Thank you. That's going to do it for our conversation today. Once again, I do want to thank Professor CJ for coming onto the show and talking history. I always like to poke the brains of historians whenever we can get them on to talk. In order to close up the show, we do have some new patrons to thank, as well as some pledge edits to thank. We have a new patron, Thomas, display name pending, and Jennifer, as well as a pledge edit from Colette and Shane. Thank you all so much for supporting the show through patreon.com/nakedmormonism and giving us your hard-earned cash. What may be a coffee a month for you is a lifestyle and endless research for me, so thank you very much for your devotion. With that, I do want to remind everybody, we are just a month away from the live My Book of Mormon show at Squatters Pub on July 29th, beginning at 7 p.m. It's going to be free entry with donation basis, as well as a cash bar, and we're still working out the logistics and the details so far. But just want to remind everybody, check on the Facebook page for My Book of Mormon podcast or Naked Mormonism, and you can see pinned posts up there showing the announcement for the live show, and we would definitely love to see you there. With that, it is time to shut down the show, but the completionist in me begs appreciation from the following people who keep this show running on the back end. First, I want to thank the real Emma Hale for being the Twitter and social media guru. Thank you so much for keeping that running. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music used in the show with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to download his music there, and be sure to donate to the guy. He puts out amazing music for free for everybody. Also, I need to thank Greg Keeling for providing the artwork used in the show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog, as well as lots of Weird Mormon shit. I need to thank the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for keeping this show in the black. Be sure to check out Opening Arguments podcast to hear Thomas and Andrew talk law. Of course, this show wouldn't run without the patrons who support the show through patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Thank you all to those of you who do support. But if not for the most important part, I would just be shouting into the void. So, most crucially, I need to thank all of the amazing listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.